So we are live.
Yes.
Good evening. My name is Hoymonti Bakchi and I am an independent researcher and a freelance corporate communication trainer. I welcome you to the stories of tribal identity and culture that will explore the role of tribal literature and tribal representation in literature in shaping cultural identity and ideology, curated under TMYS Review December 2023 in collaboration with the Center of Asia Pacific Initiatives, University of Victoria. We are also calling for submissions for essays, poems, and short stories under the project. To know more about guidelines and the project architecture, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. This evening, I consider myself very privileged to be in company of our esteemed panelists, Dr. Walter Fernandez, Dr. Ashish Zaza, and Dr. Bhaktoram Mauro, who will shortly share their views and insights with us. The topic for today's discussion is ecocentrism as a concurrent theme, the role of nature in tribal life and literature under the sub-theme of fiction, non-fiction, and poetry by tribal writers. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our speakers of the day. So our first speaker for this session is Dr. Walter Fernandez. He at present is the director of Northeastern Social Research Center, Guwahati, Assam, and was formerly the director of research at Animation and Research Center, Yangon, Myanmar, and the founder director of Northeastern Social Research Center before moving to the Northeast. He was director of research and of tribal studies at Indian Social Institute, New Delhi, and editor of Social Action. He has worked extensively on tribal issues, gender issues, development-induced displacement, and conflicts and peace. He has, to his credit, more than 50 books, over 200 professional articles, and 150 newspaper articles on these issues. He has also been a member of several Government of India committees and a visiting lecturer in some universities in India and abroad. We are delighted to have you on the panel, sir. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Our second speaker for the session is Dr. Ashish Zaza, who is currently an assistant professor with Humanities and Social Sciences discipline at IIT Gandhinagar. His broader research is on urbanization and changing cityscapes of India, focusing on unexplored aspects of equity, governance, and social justice. His articles have been published and are forthcoming in international peer-reviewed journals, including Economic and Political Weekly and Social Change, edited books and volumes, including the United Nations Encyclopedia of Sustainable Development. He has presented his articles at several international and national conferences and seminars in India, Chicago, the UK, Norway, and Denmark. He has keen interest in novels, photography, music, and Western cinema. He has several book and movie reviews for varied platforms such as Medium, Doing Sociology, National Herald, RAIOT, and Youth Ki Awaaz. We are delighted to have you on the panel, sir. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Hemanti.
Our third speaker for the session is Dr. Bhaktoram Mauro, who has a PhD in geography from Northeastern Hill University. He joined NES FAS in January 2018 as a consultant and is currently a senior associate of the Research and Knowledge Management Unit. The focus of his work are on agrobiodiversity, agroecology, health, and nutrition, food sovereignty, along with promotion and revitalization of traditional farming practices like jhum and highlighting the rich agrobiodiversity from the indigenous territories of East India. He is currently working in the FAO-supported project implementation of indigenous peoples, biocentric restoration project, and the food insecurity experience scale survey in Northeast India, and implementing the tool for agroecology performance evaluation in India, Thailand, Mexico, and Kenya. We are delighted to have you, sir, on the panel. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. So we will now open the forum for discussion. I would request Dr. Walter Fernandez to share his insights. Sir, over to you now.
Thank you very much for the huge introduction. It may not be true, but doesn't matter. And for this opportunity. Well, all that I can do is to share my experience of working with the tribal communities for 4 decades now. And one thing you realize as soon as you get involved with the tribal communities is their closeness to their ecocentrism, I would say, closeness to nature. And that is what matters. But the things have changed. Traditionally, they had a sustainable, renewable type of management of the natural resources, particularly land and forests. They treated the natural resources as an asset, a gift coming back from the past generations to be used by the present generation according to their need and environmental imperatives, and then to be preserved for the next generation. So it was intergenerational equity as well as intragenerational equity. And that also gave some space to women, unlike in settled agriculture. The man took charge, chose the men decided which family will get how much land, the time, etc. Then the man of the family chose the plot for use that day in shifting cultivation, did the worship nature to ask God's pardon for destroying some trees, and then the woman took charge of the land, of production, of work. In that sense, the woman was not equal to men. In no tribe was she equal. All tribes are patriarchal. However, she had some decision making power as long as it was community owned land, community managed land. Now, that was sustainable, renewable land and forest management. That is something that is disappearing, if it has not disappeared already, for various reasons. The first is consumerism that has overtaken the natural resources. They have lost control over the natural resources, and today it is no more renewable. And they themselves are forced to turn forests and other natural resources into sources of present income rather than renewably managed, sustainably managed resource, because of the shortages caused by clear felling of forests for timber, then use of all their takeover of all their land in the name of national development and other development, and the shortages that it causes and their impoverishment by these processes. They themselves have become partners in this in this process of destroying resources, and that's for sheer survival, not for profit, as in the case of industry. And that is something that we have to bear in mind and find ways of going back, not going back to their traditional system. That is not viable anymore, but of going back to the tradition of sustainable, renewable management. So, re-establish the community in some form, not in the traditional form, re-establish the renewable nature of their resources, and that is that alone can make it eco-centric, and that requires the type of pattern of development that is not that does not take development only as infrastructure building and economic growth as it is today, but combines infrastructure and economic growth with people's development and protection of the environment. Economic growth, people's development, and the environment have to go in hand, and that is would be the modern uh, interpretation of tribal development, and that is what we need to attempt. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your insightful observations, sir. I would now request Dr. Ashish Khaka to share his insights. Sir, over to you now.
Um, Thank you, Amanti. Am I audible to you? Okay.
Yes, you are.
Thank you so much for this platform. It is actually quite scary to speak after Dr. Walter Fernandez, someone whom I've very looked up to and whose work I've quoted extensively in my own work. So, what I'll try to do is that I'll link today's theme with what Dr. Fernandez just spoke about. We are here to talk about ecocentrism as a tribal philosophy. So, what I want to say is that when we talk about philosophy, it is always rooted in the real world, right? So, if we are saying that if we have to look at um, literature, poetry, music, uh, these are uh, these are issues which have emanated from tribal society, from everyday life. And what I'll do is that I'll, in a way, merge two of my articles and sort of give a very brief account of uh, what actually consists of ecocentrism. So if we see that, tribes in India have primarily historically lived on land and forests. Some tribes, they still live exclusively on food gathering and hunting, and hence they are highly dependent on forests for their survival. So over time, as their livelihood has been deeply attached with the forest, so has the culture in a way evolved around forests, rivers, and the larger ecosystem. So if you see across states in Orissa, Andhra Pradesh, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, in the northeast, you have several communities, tribal communities, who have stayed in very close proximity with nature, and even sociologically, anthropologically, the whole conception of tribe is also very much attached to the forest. Yet, as Dr. Fernandez is saying, things are rapidly changing. Tribes have become increasingly engulfed in the ambit of development, and the way development has been conceptualized. Uh, you know, people have often used the word Eurocentrism, but I think it's important to understand where does this come from, because the way development was conceived in Europe, particularly in the United Kingdom, was a model of dependency, a model of how land was converted into a trustee of development of capital. Now, when colonialism comes to India, we see that tribal land is often brought under British control because for the most part we have natural resources which are in tribal areas. Now tribal land becomes a trustee during the colonial times, and that policy has continued in the post-colonial era. It has not, in a way that, when we talk about the post-colonial time, it is important to know that the post-colonial policies did not break away, or did not have a significant breakup from the colonial policy. It was a continuation of the colonial policy, which meant further land grab, exploitation, a deeper penetration of the state for the purpose of what they define as national development, for the purpose of a national good. So this is where the crisis of ecology, this is where the crisis of society, this is where the crisis of culture actually comes into the larger picture. And this is where you have the largest displaced population in India are the tribal communities, and Dr. Fernandez's work has been, a significant light in that regard. Meaning, in terms of the data, in which it has shown that how has development actually induced this displacement. But what we are trying to say in this webinar is that, it is not possible, as Dr. Fernandez said, that, it is not possible as a sociological reality to go back in time and reclaim some of the very old traditions that tribal communities have had. What we can do and what we need to do urgently, I think, in this era of climate change, and you have the Anthropocene coming in, various agencies around the world, United Nations, several governments have in increasingly realized that it is the indigenous people, it is the tribal communities who had a very strong, very holistic relationship with nature, without romanticizing that relationship. They did have a sacred interface, a sacred relationship with nature. And to come back to one of the articles which I wrote, Sustainable Urbanization in the Tribal or Indigenous Areas of India, if we connect that to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, if we are talking about if we have to define sustainability in its very basic term, where that we are leaving behind land, resources, forests, the ecology, the larger ecology, not just for ourselves, but for our future generations. It is increasingly important to shift the rationality of development from exploitation to cohabitation and sustainability. The rationale of development, which has been increasingly built on exploitation, needs to be shifted, and it is imperative to shift that focus of exploitation into something of cohabitation and learning from the indigenous people as to what has been their own their the way that they did they lived with nature, they engaged with nature. Now, this is also a difficult task, because we find that, because of the fact that a lot of urban development has taken place on tribal towns, there has been a loss of community knowledge, there has been a loss of oral history. So this is where a project like this can really be an important intervention, because here we are having dialogues with people from the indigenous communities and people from outside, who do want to preserve the oral history, the oral tradition, and in a way recalibrate what we are talking about, ecocentrism. And this is where I feel that a dialogue is extremely important between people from different stakeholders, poets, writers, scholars, academicians, people from the civil sector. All of them need to come and have a larger dialogue with each other, and it is then that we can sort of recalibrate what the theme of the webinar is, that ecocentrism as a tribal culture. Once, if we can sort of achieve, if we can sort of start building our momentum towards that, we can look at a larger goal of within this set of this century itself. If we can preserve the ecology with the traditional knowledge and wisdom of the indigenous community. So with that, I would say that it is. I'm glad that we are having this dialogue, and I think uh, we need to extend this dialogue to a much broader community so that we can actually start getting insights and sort of sort of having a dialogue as to what do we mean by ecology in the contemporary times. So with that, I'll end my submission, and I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really helpful, and it was very insightful observations you provided us. So I would request Dr. Bhaktoram Mauros to share his insights. Sir, over to you now.
Thank you, Himanti. First of all, I'd like to thank you for calling me here. I mean, this is my second time here. So I'm really happy to be part of this again. So when you talk about the work that I am doing in my organization, we are working on indigenous people food system. And there's a very important statistic that you must all know. The statistic is about like 80% of the remaining diversity in the world, biodiversity in the world, is still it's found in 25% of the territories in the world, and those territories actually belong to indigenous people. So basically, you look at the statistics, you realize that indigenous people have been living in those regions for many thousands of years. Take example the case of the Khasis. Now there was a genetic study done recently, which I came across, which showed that the Khasi and the Munda, obviously we always knew because of linguistic reason, they were always connected. There was a genetic connection also was found out. I was found out that the Khasi may have been in this region for another 4 to 5 thousand years ago, and that's when the genetic link between Munda and the Khasi broke off. But of course, they still share it. So you can see that they have been there for the last 4 or 5 thousand years, but still they have been able to preserve a lot of the environment around them. And so that is actually a very big thing, which is not just happening in Meghalaya, but also throughout the world. Wherever you have indigenous people staying, you always find that there's a lot of diversity which is there. So like for example, in India also, look at the biodiversity hotspot, the Himalayan region. You have the Western Ghats. All of those regions do have a lot of indigenous people. And the work that we do is basically on indigenous people food system, basically looking at agrobiodiversity. Initially, that was how I started working with the organization. So in 2018, we did a survey which found out that if you were to go to any individual village in Meghalaya or Nagaland, the amount of diversity you find is very, very high. In fact, the average amount of agrobiodiversity, and this is the part of the biodiversity, these are like all the food, with animal, with the plant, when you combine them together, which are used for human consumption, they are known as agrobiodiversity. So when you look at this figure, you find that average amount of agrobiodiversity just in plants, not animals, just in plants. You have around 200 food plants in a village. People can give you a name. These are all the food plants. Out of that, maybe half is coming from the forest. So you have this huge amount of agrobiodiversity. That this doesn't include the animals. This doesn't include the insects, the fish. So if you combine all that together, there's a huge amount of diversity. And how does diversity help, especially in this day and age of climate change? I think Dr. Ashish already talked about that. So in 2021, our organization helped in writing a book along with FAO. It was a book on indigenous people, food system, and climate change. So this book actually won the best award for the best report in the world in that year, like sustainability report, where we did a case study of one of the villages that we're working with. Is in East Khasi Hills. It's a village which has jhum as the most important dominant form of cultivation. And so they found that these village, and along with it, so many other villages, let's say, so many other areas around the world, because this study was done in 12 locations around the world. We find that the system used in this village, with a jhum system, has a lot of attributes, a lot of characteristics which give it a lot of resilience. And this resilience, in fact, is very important for adapting to climate change. And 2021, again, based on the work that we had done, based on some other work, they did a literature review. The FAO scientific team did literature review, where they come up with another paper called the White Vipala paper on indigenous people food system, which they also presented during the side event for the United Nations Food System Summit, where they showcase that it's not just in terms of climate change, but also in terms of nutrition. It also has a very big impact, because if you think about it now, I mean, in India also we have the hunger data. things, malnutrition data, wasting, then you have stunting. It's a very big issue, and you have all that problem going on. At the same time, you are neglecting many of the traditional crops, which through literature review we have found out, and in fact this is very well establishes that they have very high amount of nutrition. But over the years, because of modernization, because the entry of market forces, and also here we have to admit that, although for very good reason, like the PDS system that the government of India introduced, which was really good for as a poverty alleviation program, to help the vulnerable households to actually at least not go hungry, to at least ensure their food security. It did lead to some of the very minor crops which are very important in their system, but really not very important in terms of market, disappearing from the areas because now you have cheap rice coming in. And that not just that. Now there are so many pressures which this local farming system are going through. Like in India, I think if you remember correctly, the central government wanted to bring in the palm oil cultivation in Meghalaya as well. Fortunately for us, our chief minister said no, we are not going to do that. But I think in Assam, in Nagaland, Mizoram, they already are doing it. And these kind of forces which are coming from outside, it's very big danger for our local food system because it has solutions for climate change, which the Vipala paper showed very clearly. Because of the diversity it has, it can really help us adapt to climate change. In fact, the genetic diversity which the system has can also help us maybe find some species or varieties which could be useful to tackle climate change. There are some minor crops. There are some crops like millet. In fact, it is very big right now, but it's very important for tackling climate change. Then there are many food crops which are very good for highly rich in micronutrients, which is important to also tackle your hidden hunger, which is the lack of micronutrient in the body. So all these issues are there, and we do believe, as we're working in our organization as fast as that, indigenous people food system, especially the local food system, is found in Meghalaya because it's not just Zoom. Please, I want you to understand, it's not just Zoom that we have. In fact, there are many other systems which are there. Maybe we can discuss about it a little later. They have a lot of solutions in terms of climate change, in terms of nutrition. We just need to leverage them. We just need to listen to the lessons they have to teach us. And I think Dr. Ashish and maybe Dr. Fernandez already talked about, there are many good principles, but we have to adapt with the time. But the adaptation has to be based, I would like to believe, on the foundation of the indigenous people knowledge system, which is reflected in their food system. And when we do that, I do feel that the indigenous people food system, the way we practice here in many other indigenous territories, can have a great deal of solutions to offer to the world. Climate change, nutrition, we can talk about other things as well. This is all I can say for now. And hopefully when we discuss more, maybe I can share more of the information about the issues that we will raise today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your insightful observation, sir. So we will now move on to the question and answer session. So my first question goes to Dr. Walter Fernandez. Sir, what is your take on the concept of interdependence of tribal life and its ecology?
Beg your pardon, can you please repeat the question?
Sure, sir.
Can
So,
you please repeat the question?
yes, please. So my question is that what is your take on the concept of interdependence of tribal life and ecology?
Well,
Am I audible, sir?
basically, it
Yeah.
was in interdependence of the tribal communities with the natural resources. It developed in such a way that we keep telling the forest department, for example, that the forests and the tribes are so interdependent that you destroy one, you destroy the other. There was total dependence of each other. The forest and the natural resources depended on the tribal communities for their life, for their sustainability, and the tribal communities traditionally depended on the natural resources, including wildlife, for their sustainable life, intergenerational and intragenerational equity. And that is something that has disappeared because the forests have been taken away and have been turned into only a raw material for industry and a source of income, not the sustainable resource. And that is where the interdependence has disappeared. And both are being destroyed. Have I answered your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you for your observations. And my next question goes to Dr. Ashish Khaka. And the question is that what are your views on urbanization as a challenging factor to tribal life and culture? Please explain your analogy.
Okay, thank you for the question. I think urban development is increasingly becoming a center stage issue, both on the national level and the at a state level. Um, for a long time, I mean, let me go back to the colonial time, and then I think it is important to see the trajectory from that time. So during the British era, we did have some important towns which came up, but if we look at, say, a city like Shillong or a city like Ranchi, these were towns which were primarily designated as administrative towns, as towns which would, harbor the military. It would have the garrisons, and it was in a way sort of center post to administer larger areas. So in the case of Ranchi, it was the central part of India. In the case of Shillong, it was the uh, what was then part of Assam. Now, what happens is that uh, in terms of policy, urban centers become very concentric. In a way, they have not decentralized urban development. So what happens is that population starts coming increasingly to towns and cities for for better employment, for economic avenues. And what this does is that it puts a lot of pressure on the civic amenities that are there in that town. So from my own study, I've realized that now we've got a new capital town coming up in Shillong, known as the New Shillong Township. In the case of Ranchi, we have the Greater Ranchi project. These are urban centers which have been created in the post independence, post liberal times. So in a way, it is a continuation of the colonial time. Why am I saying this? Because the land upon which these new urban centers are being built are mostly tribal lands. These are lands which fall either in the fifth schedule in the case of Ranchi, or the sixth schedule in the case of Meghalaya, in Shillong. These are, constitutionally safeguarded territories, because one of the primary clauses of both the fifth and the sixth schedule is that tribal land cannot be taken by non-tribals for any other for any other purpose, unless and until it is given to them by the tribes by the tribal communities themselves. Even then, it needs to be cleared by the governor in the case of the fifth schedule, and the tribal the communities in the sixth schedule. So what is happening is that because of a historical reason, you've had a population explosion that has taken place in the existing urban centers, which has led to the state governments to expand their infrastructure, to expand their urban centers, and bring more and more villages, more and more traditional tribal land into the ambit of urban development. And this is, in a way, robbing them, displacing them of their traditional habitat where they used to practice agriculture, as was discussed just before. So even in the case of New Shillong Township, when I went there for my field work, I saw that a lot of people who were actually displaced were practicing jhum cultivation and other forms of agriculture, who were displaced and that land has been taken away by the state government to build this larger capital town. So what this does is that it creates a ripple effect. On one hand, you do have a population which is increasingly getting urbanized, which is moving to towns and cities. On the other hand, you're also robbing tribal people from their own traditional land without giving them adequate rehabilitation or resettlement. So you have, this is the classic case of what is taking place as development and displacement. So if when we have this sort of a challenge, it does affect tribal life because it has an extremely adverse impact on their traditional way of life, which is connected to the ecology, forests, rivers. On the other hand, you're also hampering their culture because if you look at the intergenerational trauma that it has on successive generations of tribal communities, there is loss of language, there's loss of memory, there's loss of their own culture, their own identity. So these are various factors which do affect it. It is not just an effect that is pertaining to one generation alone. It has a cascading effect on several generations. What I'm trying to make an argument over here is that if at all we have to move towards an uh, urbanized future, we need to make tribal communities the most important stakeholders in that process. They need to be made part of the planning process. They need to be, because they understand the land much better than anyone else. They now let's now I'll give you just quickly. I'll give an example of the Khasi community and the Oraon and the Munda community. um, in the Khasi community itself, you had three broad layers of landholding patterns. You had the Rirai, Rikinti, and Rikur, which is broadly, community, clan, and private property. So you've already had a traditional culture, traditional knowledge of landholding patterns, which in a way gets affected once the urban process starts to get in, because then you lose control of your community, you lose control of your own clan land, you lose control of your own, your own private land. The same way, if you look at Jharkhand, if you look at the Uraons or the Mundas, you had the Konkati or the Bhuinhari land ownership patterns, which did mean that land was owned traditionally by the communities. So if we displace them, so it is not just displacement that is taking place here; it is also a loss of culture, a loss of memory that is taking place here. So if we have to go ahead in an urbanized path, we need this traditional knowledge to be sort of channelized through policy, as we can make tribes the important stakeholders in their own land, rather than displacing them and making way for others who don't have any idea of that land. So if they don't have any idea of that land, how will they even sustain it? Right. So my argument is that you need to make, if even if urbanization has to take place, you need to make the tribal communities who do have an important historical link with that land the most important stakeholder of the land. Then and only then can you form a link between what they had in the past and what they can actually manage to create and sustain for the future. So this is just a brief sort of example that I wanted to give for now. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your observation, sir. My next question is for Dr. Bhaktaram Mauro. Would you like to give us a brief idea about how indigenous communities have designed their unique food systems, keeping in mind their agroecology?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. And I think agroecology basically means the application of ecological principles to agriculture. So in that, it's a very well-defined subject, discipline, in fact, I would like to say. And therefore, recently, I think a few years ago, the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, they came up with 10 principles of agroecology. So basically, what these principles do is that they help you identify whether a system is agroecological or not. So the first principle under the system is the diversity. When you talk about diversity here, they're talking about three levels of diversity. You have the system diversity, you have the species diversity, and you have the genetic diversity. So when we talk about the system diversity in Meghalaya, we have the Jum, we have the Bun, we have the Kper, we have the Panthor. So you have four systems at least. Then you also have the rivers, then you have the forest. So you have, let's say, six systems, combine the natural and the cultural system. And these systems are very, very important because they give you also, which is one more important aspect of the indigenous people food system under agroecology, is resilience. For example, let's say one system fails. Let's say, for example, your Bun system fails, which is basically an adaptation of Jum in the higher areas where there is, let's say, temperature is very low, regeneration happens very slowly. So therefore, in that kind of system, you have Bun. So what happens if that fails? You at least have the forest, you at least have the kapel, which is the home garden, you at least have the river. And also, for example, let's say if one species fail, because what they do is that they practice mixed culture, mixed cropping. For example, let's say you have potato failing, you have, let's say, tapioca, you may have, let's say, for example, colocasia. So this system is, the agroecology is basic, is the most important thing is diversity. And this diversity again then leads to your resilience. Then you talk about co-creation and sharing of knowledge, which is the third principle. Now you think in terms of, for example, potato. Now potato is not from Meghalaya, it is from Peru, Bolivia, I mean the Andes mountain. When they were brought by David Scott, 1860s, what happened now? But potato is a very important crop for the Khasis right now. In fact, they have also developed local varieties of potato, which some of them are really resilient to climate change, which are missing, which are disappearing now because of hybrid seed. And so what has happened when we talk about co-creation means you take local knowledge, you take outside knowledge, and then you combine them together. So the crops that people are growing, it's all based on that co-creation, like bringing together different knowledge systems, different things together and mixing them together. And then you have synergies. Synergies basically mean that you're using the plants, the animals together, combining in them some way. So agroforestry system, that's a very good example of that. So you have efficiency. When you talk about efficiency, basically means that you have the input and output. So let's say less input, higher output. Now in this case, people may usually think about the money input. Like if I have put so much money, I can get so much output in terms of money. But here is talk about, let's say, in terms of labor. Now in Zoom system, I think Dr. Ashish and Dr. Fernandez, they have worked quite a lot on this. They would also agree with me is that the labor efficiency is very high out there. Labor, like, because you have less labor and you have more output. But of course, in terms of other inputs, but in terms of labor, is very highly efficient. And in areas, hilly areas where you have low population density, you need that kind of a system. Then you have recycling. So recycling basically means that the resources do not go out of the system; they recycle within the system. So you have a lot of these. When you burn down, let's say when you slash and burn, I wouldn't say slash and burn. I would say okay, slash and burn. Let's say slash and burn. What do you do is that you take the biomass and then burn it, and then it goes back to the soil. And then you also make your own compost. So you all this is recycling within the system. And then you have human and social values. Now, these are values are very important, like caring and sharing. Sharing food with each other. Looking after your neighbors, looking after your community. This also is part of the system. Then you have culture and food traditions. Now I think we all know that every tribe, every community, they have their own food tradition, their own culture, and there's a lot of stories around that, a lot of folk tales around that. And then you have responsible governance. And this is something Dr. Ashish really mentioned just now. We talk about the rewrite. What a rewrite? Basically, they are commons. Rewrite where I can go and settle there and do farming. As long as I'm using the land, that land belongs to me. But the moment I leave the land fallow for 3 years, it goes back to the community. In some areas, people are trying to make sure that nobody privatizes these lands. Because you know what? If I'm a landless person in the village, and this is what I want to explain also. When you look at the census report 2011, it says that Meghalaya has 70% landlessness. I don't agree with that data. The reason being that the question doesn't really ask you, do you have land? Yes, I don't have land, but I have community land. I can access that. So that is not really taking care into that. So therefore, we have it. This is called responsible governance, so looking after everyone. And then the circular and solidarity economy. Basically, it means the local food, local markets, where you don't have to go very far. And this is also very good for climate change because the shorter the value chain, then the less the greenhouse gas emission. So you have these local markets which are based on tradition. Like in the Khasis, it's basically 8 days. We go every 8 day there is a market. And we have a calendar based on the market. So, and this is all based on our culture. And the only thing, this aim, who is the, let's say, the king or the tribal chief, he has only one source of revenue, which is the toll gate from the markets. So all of this combined together, it creates what you call agroecology. And if a system like the system we have in Meghalaya, in Nagaland, the indigenous people food system, it has those principles, then becomes agroecological. And this is what we are doing right now. We're doing some project where we're trying to measure these, and you find that initial result, they score very high in agroecology. So indigenous people food system is always done with keeping the principles of agroecology in mind. And I hope that we can protect it and strengthen it so they can continue doing that. That's all from my side for this time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. That was very insightful. I move on to the next question. And this question is for Dr. Walter Fernandez. Sir, speaking in context of ecofeminism, how does displacement affect tribal life and especially tribal women?
Well, tribal life totally, because as one said, about around 40% of people who lose life to in the name of national development are tribals. Now, uh, let me when it and in most of them are not counted, because most tribes live on community land, which in the definition of the colonial laws, that land laws that continue to be in force, it's common land, which is state property. So they are not given, and even when it's individual land, the price of land is extremely low. The compensation they get is very low, simply because they are in the so-called backward areas. So the whole concept of land as livelihood is lost, and just it becomes just capital, and they lose because of that. Very few of them are rehabilitated. According to my calculation, out of 70 million people displaced or deprived of livelihood, around 30 million were displaced. Only about 15% of them had been resettled. I say resettled, not necessarily rehabilitated. But the proportion of the tribal DPs, displaced persons resettled, is much lower than 10%, because they are not even, many of them are not even counted among the displaced. And that's the problem. And the proportion of the displaced is much higher among them. Then, when it comes to women, first of all, their status is slightly higher than their counterparts in the caste societies, because of their economic assets on their community land. That makes them, the fact of economic assets, which is signified by bride price, that's a bad word though, bride price rather than dowry. Bride price is actually compensation paid to the family by the man for taking a worker away from the family. Now, that she has a slightly higher economic and social status, but it depends on, she has more decision, some decision making power. It depends on the community owned, community managed land, and that is lost with displacement. So she loses the source of her social and economic status. When, if compensation is paid, it's paid to the, if they are resettled, the house is in the name of the man. If the job is given, it's given to the man. The why the woman is reduced to being the housewife alone, and if she gets any work, it is unskilled work, not the, and often both men and women internalize the upper caste culture ideology of the woman being dependent on the man, of being in the kitchen and so on, and they accept it, and she's used to being a housewife, and often, even if she were to get unskilled work, often the man is not allowed to do that, because he has an office job, and he says that it's against the status of an office worker, which is a peon's job, his wife doing such a menial job. So so both the social and economic and cultural status, all three are lost, and the impoverishment of women is greater, because if, for example, the man has some money as a job, He accepts the middle class culture of consumerism, spends much more money on himself, and makes much less money available to the family, to the woman to run the house. But remains responsible for household management. So she's caught in this vicious circle of poverty, but having her traditional duties without the traditional resources to manage. Her poverty and status loss is greater than that of the man. I stop at this again.
Thank you, sir. That was the numbers which you mentioned were alarming, and it's truly very informative to talk about this particular topic. So we move on to our next question for Dr. Ashish Kaka. So the question is that what are the basic points to learn for the urban population from the indigenous communities living in the hinterlands?
Okay, thank you for your question. I think um, one of the key features that we observe in urban areas is the increasing nuclearization of the families, communities, and a very sort of direct break from the traditional, from their own traditional societies. Now, there are two sides to this. One is that, uh, like, okay, let me bring in the caste angle as well, so that we get a context over here. In During the Constituent Assembly debates, we had Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who said that, uh, you know, his quote is often there that the village is the den of ignorance, evil, and several caste problems. And one of the ways that he proposed to come out of this conundrum was that and he was talking from his experiences in America, where he had engaged with the African American community, and he said that one of the ways in which the caste question, especially the Dalit question, can be addressed is if we move towards cities where he felt that caste would be sort of eliminated in the urban spaces. Cut to 70 years from now, that has not been the case. Caste has become increasingly more complex in urban spaces. But if you look at the tribal question, and caste has in a way become even more manifested in the economic arena. So if you look at the idea of affirmative action itself, we have affirmative action is not practiced in the private sector. It is only limited to the public sector. Now, increasingly, we are finding that the public sector is getting diminished. More and more of the public sector is getting diminished. Now, this is also a way not just to allow capital to take over the country's economy, but also a way to shut down most of the voices which people would say are from the margins. But I argue that if you look at the census itself, the SC, ST, OBC population constitute more than 50 to 60% of the country's population. So, in what ways are they classified as marginal? It is very confounding to me. Whereas they constitute the majority section of the population that is living in this country. Now, coming to what are the basic points that the urban population can learn from the indigenous communities is that, um, you know there is a distinct lack of, I mean, the caste system is not prevalent, say per se, within the tribal communities. That is not to say that they do not have shortcomings of their own, but the amount of mar of marginality that you experience within the caste system, the hierarchy that you experience within the caste system itself, the social hierarchy that you experience, the economic hierarchy, also the personal, psychological, and the cultural hierarchy that is there. That for a large part, is not prevalent in the tribal societies who have, who did have a much more, much more heterogeneous approach towards life. It is not just a homogeneous approach towards life. One is that uh, the first point that I would say is that a distinct lack of caste atrocity, the caste oppression that is there in tribal community. The second is, again, going back to the theme of this webinar, is that uh, if today, if you go to any city in India, Delhi, Mumbai, Calcutta, Bangalore, one of the striking features of that city are the traffic jams, are the extremely long jams that we often see. This is also due to the fact that there has been increasing modernization, commercialization, and the fact that the way the economy has shaped has led to a lot of dependency, with people traveling to several other to almost from one part of the town to the other. That was not necessarily the case with tribal communities whose larger economy was rooted in the forests, in the rivers. So even if you're looking at from an economic angle, can we make an attempt? Can we imagine an economy where there is not so much stress put upon the urban landscape? Can we imagine an economy where we do have a workspace, or a sort of, the pandemic has actually highlighted this much more than any other event, that it is so important that it has actually challenged the way the economy has actually been designed in the last 300 years. One of the greatest sufferers of that was the United States, which is the biggest capitalist country in the world. They were grappling with this crisis, and just to compare, a small country like Cuba was able to handle the crisis at a much better level because of the socialist policies which they all already had. So it it is not just to say it's about socialism or communism. The idea that a communitarian approach, which the tribal communities have had, which they have, in a way, they are losing over time due to the forces of modernity. Can we think of that, bringing that part into the urban population, which has become increasingly self-centric, much more distant, alienated from their own community, from their own land, from their own past. And this is why, because of this alienation, they have lost their own culture, their own language, their own memory. So if we bring back this communitarian approach, I think it can make a significant difference to the urban population that is living there. And which is, again, going back to my earlier point, that if we are looking at sustainable urbanization, sustainable urban development, we need to make the tribal communities front and center, the stakeholders of that process. So I'll rest my case here.
Thank you, sir. It was very enlightening. So my next question goes to Dr. Bhakturam Mauro. Sir, apart from the policymakers, what steps can common people take to ensure sustainable agrobiodiversity?
I think thank you for the question. It's a bit difficult because actually you see the state has a lot of power in terms of how to, create a certain kind of a demand. So basically, you look in terms of, for example, India. I think there was a, I think you must know Debal Dev. He's a scientist, especially working in agrobiodiversity, especially rice. So what he did was that I remember him talking about it like 1960s, 1960s, 70s, before Green Revolution came about in India. India had 1 lakh rice varieties. But now when you look to this generation, now at the moment you have no 6 to 7,000 varieties. What happened to all your varieties? It's not just the lack of diversity or the loss of all those local varieties. It's also loss of many other food items as well. Right now we have called a homogenization of food system, like a menu. Basically, I eat rice, I eat dal, I eat the same chicken. I mean, like all the vegetables are almost similar. But look at the local food; they're already almost missing. You don't find them anymore. So that is something that has to be that has to be tackled, especially by the common people, because they are the consumers. I know it's a bit difficult, but if they are not going to demand, let's say if they are they going to demand for, let's say, a more agro-biodiverse diet, then only you can generate this demand. And you look in terms of like the diversity that we have, like for example, staples. When we talk about staples in India, what do we think? Rice, maybe wheat to a certain extent. But what we don't know is that there are many areas where rice or wheat was not a staple. You had millet in some areas, like in many tribal areas. Millet also is a staple in a cereal, but also you have colocasia, quechua. Actually, that also is a staple. What happens in Mexico, where they have no rice, they have no wheat, they used to have maize, which is a staple. What happened to Pacific Islands, when they have no rice, no wheat, they had yam. So different areas had different staples. Now we need to bring back those staples. Is very important. I remember talking to the same of Sora, and I asked him, in the past, what did you have to eat? He said, no, you know what we used to eat? Shrew, which basically means colocasia, quechua. Now you may say, is that a staple? Yeah, of course it's a staple. It's a high source of carbohydrate and also very high source of calcium. And look at millet, which is now the year of the millet, which actually the Indian government actually proposed this to the United Nations, and so therefore they brought out the year of the millet this year. But in Meghalaya, we have a very endemic variety of millet which is found nowhere in the world except in Khasi Hills. It's called Raishan. It's a folio, it's a species of that. So, we have all this diversity, but people don't want to eat them, especially the wild vegetable coming from the forest. So in Khasi, when we have these wild vegetables, we call them jathang, like jalinyar, jangyo, jamardo. So the word ja, which is coming before the name, like of other, like a prefix, means food. But these are forests. So you bring from the forest, but you still call them food because what they were being consumed by the people. But now let's say you go to to the villages, if they give you food, let's say you go for something, they don't give you local food. They give you biscuit, they give you like atta and all those other kind of food which are not from there. So I think what we have to do, and the local people especially, I think that the common people, is that ask for a more diverse diet based on the local place, because then the diet also becomes seasonal. And you need to have seasonal diet, because if you don't want to have seasonal diet, you're basically depending on a very long value change, or for example very high, like you said, let's say the very big how should I go downs and all those things which can be only controlled by certain big companies. Basically the whole like three farm laws, what was it all about? It was all about how to give the control of the Indian farming sector to Adanis and Ambanis and all those who are building all those big warehouses for them. But we have to convert, we have to I have to fight against that and also maintain agrobiodiversity. We have to value our agrobiodiversity. This is something what you call, like most of this food are called poor man's food. Correct. If you're eating that, you're a poor person. But no, and they're highly nutritious. I mean, we did a comparison between the market food and the food we get from the local area. The comparison is nowhere. It's our local food is very high. But why is it that we are getting market food? Because there is a perception being created. First of all, these are food which is not meant to be eaten by civilized people, first of all, so don't eat them. The moment you stop eating them, the moment you stop using them, the knowledge goes away, the culture goes away, then you don't feed it. Like for example, we used to organize here farmers market in the city. People would come and buy the vegetables from our farmers, but they don't know how to cook it anymore. They have forgotten the knowledge. But in the villages, it's still there, but they are slowly losing it. So therefore, my suggestion, and this may be my prayer to the people, that please value your local vegetables, your local crops. Try to make it seasonal. Try to support your local farmers. That is the only way, because then we will not only save our agrobiodiversity, we also can save our own sovereignty, which is that not being controlled by MNCs who are going to like 50% or 60% of the seed business in India controlled by only 4 or 5 companies. Imagine the day when all the seed is being controlled by certain companies, and what do you do then? But you have so many local seeds, you have so many local varieties, you need to consume them. So and I think Dr. Zaka and Dr. Fernandez has come to Shillong. You have this Kong shop, you go and have tea out there, you have some local snacks out there. For me, these are the ones that are saving our local food, because these are gone. When you have KFCs and you have Domino's, I don't mind them, they're fine. But when our local Kong shops, they are gone, that's when the local food system also disappear. And then you also, the agrobiodiversity will disappear, because if people are not consuming it, why are you growing it? So I think for me, that is very important. Supporting our local farmers, that is the only way we can we can sustain our agrobiodiversity.
Thank you, sir. That was really informative and thought provoking. So I move on to my next question. And Dr. Walter Fernandez, this question is for you. What do you think? Is modernization and tribal culture antithetical? If so, how?
No, I do not say that. What I say is that modernization without preparing the community are antithetical, and modernization without the preparation of the community strengthens class formation and patriarchy. But that part is important, without preparation. not modernization by itself. We cannot be anti modernist. It means we have to question the type of modernization and the type of development, not development itself, not modernization in itself, but what type of development, what type of modernization.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for
Well,
your answer.
I'm
So,
afraid I have another appointment. I have to leave. I'm sorry. Can I leave?
sure, sir.
Okay. Sorry about it, but I have to go.
Okay,
It
sir.
was at 7:30. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. So we move on to the next question, and this question is for Dr. Ashish Kaka. Can urbanization be in the indigenous hinterlands be made sustainable without affecting their culture, heritage, and lifestyle?
Um, Urbanization and urban development have to take into account their cultural heritage and their lifestyle. It is only then that it can be made sustainable. Because if we are saying that, if we go to the definition of sustainability, uh, as I said before, if we are planning, if we are doing a town planning, I'm not a town planner, but I have studied cities. Any town, any city has a master plan which talks about for the next almost 20 to 30 years. So if we incorporate tribal knowledge, be it in terms of their land ownership patterns, be it in terms of how have they been able to sustain their traditional livelihoods in a rural setting. Now we have to bear in mind that there is a transition taking place from rural areas to the urban area, so the dynamics will certainly change. The access that they traditionally had to their own land might be reduced when they move to an urban area. That being said, if we can make sure that, again, if we make sure that they are active participants in the planning process, in the master plan, and the fact that we can incorporate their traditional knowledge in the urban master plans, it is only then that we can actually we can move towards a holistic and sustainable urban model. So previous urban models, if we look at what happened in Europe, it was based on the fact that the municipality was the head of the urban centers. The same thing was followed in America, and the same thing was imposed upon India, that the municipality becomes the head of the urban centers. What that does is that it does not give communities active control on their own land, on their own spaces. That has led to massive detriment. So if there's an urban crisis in the US or in Europe, it is always the municipality which is there to address. So because of the fact that it has not allowed the communities to take control of their own land. And the same model has been blindly, superimposed upon India, where you did have communities who did own large swaths of land and who did have a knowledge about that land. So there, I think there has to be an alteration of that model. So where the municipal corporation is not the center, but the people are the center of the decision making process. Then and only then there has to be a power shift. It is only then that we can see that it's only then that we can think of making urban spaces as sustainable areas. And so unless and until power is not decentralized, power is not given to the communities, we cannot think of a sustainable future. So I think that shift, and I know that a lot of people will be hesitant towards it, because this has been in practice for the last 200 to 300 years. So that shift is difficult, but it needs to happen, because we are staring at a global crisis in this time. So unless and until that shift doesn't take place, we cannot have we can't have a sustainable future. So that shift has to take place.
Thank you, sir. That was illuminating. So my next question, I'll move on to Dr. Bhaktoram Mauro. You have been speaking a lot about food sovereignty and indigenous food systems in the Northeast. Please share the relevance of indigenous identity with respect to food sovereignty. and its importance.
Thank you very much. First, I'd like to tackle the issue of food sovereignty. So basically, like COVID-19, which happened like a couple of years ago, which went on for 2 years, a lot of disruption happened to our community. Initially, in the first few days, I mean, there was supposed to be supply of PDS rice coming in, but of course, everyone was suffering. So you had the trucks which were stopped in the Assam border because they had to first get their own share, which was, of course, you can understand that. But then, even though we got the PDS rice, even though there was so much help that came in during that time, which we're very grateful about to the government of India, to our Meghalaya government, to a lot of the individuals and people who also contributed to all of the organizations. I think it must have been the same everywhere. You know, people came out to support other people in this time of need, which is very great to see. I mean, apart from all the, the very sudden announcement and then so many people, like that is a different thing altogether. But what happened in Meghalaya is that many other farmers, many communities realize, I think it's very difficult to actually depend on outside food because you never know. Nobody thought, I mean, I personally never thought we'll have a COVID 19 where streets will be deserted. I mean, like shops are closed. I mean, people are scared of each other. I mean, I never thought it would happen. So people realize, you know what, we need to have our own food sovereignty. So some people, especially in Ribhoy area, what they did, they went back to hill farming on the rice, hill rice farming. What happened that they had forgotten the practice of hill rice farming. They were doing farming in the paddy field on the wet rice cultivation, but not hill rice. So they went back to that. Many other people started again taking into consideration their own local food system. And we did a study in 2021 during the COVID-19. There was the online study. I mean, just after the COVID-19 had just ended. So we did something called the food insecurity experience scale. This again is a UN like a model. So we did, there are 8 questions within that to ask them the level of food insecurity people must have faced during this 1 year. In fact, I think the whole global hunger index also was built on that. And Indian government also had an issue with that, which is based on sample and based on subjectivity, which I argue, yeah, okay, sample size may be a problem, but subjectivity was not the issue because the questions were very good. And when we did the survey in Meghalaya, we did survey in 18 villages, 14 in Meghalaya, 4 in Nagaland. What we found was that the severe food insecurity was around 12% in Meghalaya and Nagaland. The same figure internationally was 40% in South Asia, 30% all over the globe. And this finding we actually had shared in the United Nations as well, where we had gone for our own seminar. And eventually in the book also, which came out from FAO, it also discussed about this finding, showing that, like there's a lot of strength in the indigenous people food system to actually be food sovereign. Now, there was also an issue, like especially in hill areas, people think, what, we can't really have food self-sufficiency. And you look at the agricultural data from the government of Meghalaya, or I don't know, any other government, I know only my government, you'll see that, what, if you look at the government data and the amount of food being produced, yeah, there seems like, we can't be self-sufficient. But that data doesn't consider some of the foods which we are consuming, like colocasia, not like then there's something like soplam, which is the Khasi name, which is a tuber, it's not there. Then many of the wild food, it's not there. And then the crop cutting exercise being done to get to the figure that they have out there doesn't consider the kitchen garden, which is very important. Especially when you go to West Khasi Hills, you find huge areas in the kitchen garden. How can you ignore that system which is giving so much to the people? So when you take all that into consideration and the fact that they depend on the forest, like I remember going for this, helping a friend for a PhD. So we asked the people, during COVID-19, what did you do? Because we were trying to understand about the wild meat consumption. Oh, you know what? We went to the forest, we went fishing, or went to my field. If you had any problem, no, it's okay, no problem. If I get bored, I just go and collect something from the forest. I just go and fish. So, there is the inherent food sovereignty which we have, but of course, it's seasonal, which means the storage units have to be there, all those things have to be there, infrastructure is not there. But if we can solve that, I think there is a possibility the tidal areas can have food sovereignty because we just need to understand the staples and the different micronutrient rich crops. Now, coming to our culture and identity, it's very much based on our culture and identity because the system that we have in terms of the diversity comes from our governance system, which are commons, which are private land, but and commons, which have our traditional bodies. And then the culture that, when you do something, you could discuss together, so that all it comes under that. And also, for example, the stories around it. Like, for example, we have the stories of rice, how the Jaintia, among the Jaintia people, they discovered rice from the forest. Now, very interestingly, what we found, so like the origin of rice is in China, for example, 8,000 years ago, and then 4,000 years ago, rice appears in India. But of course, it must have intermixed with their local variety, which already there was India, a semi-wild variety. So what happened? Where is the middle? What happened in the middle? So what we found is that there was a report published many years ago about there was a specific rice variety found in Garo Hills, which is 6,000 years old. Could this be the link between the China and the India rice? I don't know. It was just a report. So there was so much story out there. In fact, rice people call here Lukmi, means Lakshmi. They're very like a local version of Lakshmi. And what do they say? When you steal anything, it's fine, but you steal rice, it's sin, because rice is so important for them. Look at in terms of the name of places we have here. We have Mauthat Raishan, the Raishan variety, which is the only endemic variety in India and all over the world. This volume, we have a name over that. Pamlokrai, Jarain is a wild vegetable. We have a name over that. So we have all these stories, and the name itself tells you a story. Like for example, we have Dainaga. Like for example, like Rimbai Naga, Rimbai Manipur. So which means that sometime in the past, this must have come from Manipur or Nagaland, or maybe had brought by somebody. So you have name of like the Krai the Khar. Krai means millet, and the Khar means outsider. So somebody must have gone outside and brought this rice over here. So there are so many stories, migration history can be built around that our own culture is built around that. Like for example, in Sendai, there was a movie made many years ago, I think with Tarun Bhartia. I think maybe Ashish knows about him. So what happened in that is that he told a story of how a community tried to revive millet. Because what happened was that they stopped using the festival because it was festival for women when they were doing weeding. And when they do weeding, they used to make beer out of millet and drink, and they dance on the throughout the village. It was very nice, very gay, very so much fun. But one day stopped growing millet, they stopped the festival, and people revived that. Women dancing, drinking, and dancing. Nobody cares. Nobody looking at them. Like no, no, it's not good. No, nothing like that. And also in our own village in Sora, we are trying to revive millet cultivation again, but people again doing these old festivals. Like the culture part in terms of religion, it might be disappearing because most people are Christians, but that identity part of it, that link to the land, the link to the crops. In fact, there are many crops which are taboo for certain clans. They can't eat those plants, no. So all of that is part of that, and that comes from the land, from the system that we use, the bun, the pear, the panthor, so all of that, the forest. So I think our system can give us food sovereignty. I do believe in that. But of course, there has to be a lot of work being done, how to build the infrastructure around it. And to link to our culture is very strong. I think, I mean, if we lose all that, what's the point of having a name of a plant which is not there anymore? So I think it's very strong.
Thank you, sir. That was really fascinating. So this brings
I
us to the
just, I
end
just,
of, yes,
yeah,
yes.
I just wanted to add one point there. So I think in 2015, NESFAS had organized the Terra Madre in Nehu. So that had indigenous communities from 50 countries come
Yes.
and share their food, not just their food but their cultural activities. So it was actually, I was there, and I was actually struck by the fact that I mean, they had an innovative name for it called slow food, which was the sort of the alternative to fast food. So, I was struck by the fact that if we do have food systems which have been, either they have been tried to being homogenized for market forces, why can't we revive that in a time when we are facing abject crisis? And given the diversity of indigenous food systems, not just in Meghalaya, in Jharkhand, around the world, and that was very visible in Terra Madre. So I felt that that can be a great alternative, not just for the community but also for the world, to learn about agri-systems, to learn about these knowledges, which again ties back to how the idea of ecocentrism. Everything revolves around the ecology. So I think, yeah, I just wanted to share that.
I think just one thing, maybe Haimanti, I'll just like to inform Dr. Ashish is that next year we are organizing a mini Terra Madre, not will be as big as the last time. See, I wasn't there last time, I joined after that. So you're very
Okay,
much invited to come there. I mean, it'll be nice if you are
please,
there.
I'll be happy. Shillong is my field site anyway, so I keep coming there. So I'll
Yeah,
be happy to
please
come
come.
there. Yeah,
And Haimanti also
sure,
can come if you want.
sure.
Thank you so
This is,
much.
yeah.
Okay, so this brings us to the end of today's session, and I would like to thank all the panelists once again for sharing their invaluable perspectives on the topic. So, this is to remind that we are calling for submissions on tribal literature and tribal representation in literature, the details of which can be viewed on www.tellmeastory.biz. We will come back to you soon with our next panel discussion on the project. Till then, good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.